Hello and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Mel Ruche, originally from Libertyville, Illinois. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Geoscience studying paleoclimate with the goal of better informing predictions of ice sheet fluctuation and sea level rise. I am pleased to introduce Brooke Norsted, Assistant Director of the UW Geology Museum. Brooke has 24 years of experience with informal earth science education, with the past 17 served at the UW Geology Museum. Studying rocks and fossils has meant she has been able to explore the high desert of Eastern Oregon, excavate dinosaurs in Canada, study ancient amphibian footprints in Oklahoma, work at Arches National Park in Utah, spend a summer at the edge of the Matanuska Glacier in Alaska, and investigate why a giant lake covered a quarter of Wyoming 50 million years ago. She is excited to share with you today the stories we glean from Wisconsin rocks and fossils. Please welcome Brooke Norsted.
All right. Thank you so much, Mel, for the introduction. And thank you, Fran, for the invitation and for everybody for being here today. I'm excited to share stories about Wisconsin geology and travel around the state with you today. So I wanted to really begin with an invitation to you all to come and visit the UW Geology Museum when we reopen to the public. We're located on the UW-Madison campus, and we're 2 blocks east of Camp Randall Stadium, where the Badgers play football. And this is a pretty typical scene pre-pandemic in the museum, one that I miss a lot. We host a story time twice a month for preschoolers, and then of course have lots of school children and the public visit the museum as well. So if you're here today, you probably are interested and curious about rocks and minerals and fossils. So that's what we've got. And we're free, we're typically open, so do put us on your post-pandemic to-do list. So the topic at hand today, though, to really get down to it, I am a geologist and I am the daughter of a librarian. So the theme and thinking about stories and stones really speaks to me. And this is a favorite quote I have from the author John McPhee. And he says, rocks are records of events that took place at the time they formed. They're books. They have a different vocabulary, a different alphabet, but you learn how to read them. And this is really true. I hope to make you a little more curious about the rocks that you see around Wisconsin by the end of our time together. And there's kind of 2 different paths here that I want to use this metaphor with when we're thinking about stories in stones. And so to lay some of that groundwork before we get into the actual stories, first off, you can think about, we talk about reading the rocks and reading the rock record. And one way we do that is by looking at the colors, the textures, and the context of rocks. So, what do they look like? What can we tell by looking at them? What can we tell by looking at them and their surroundings? And so these are each 3 images that we're going to get into later on today. But they all leave distinct clues that help us learn their stories. And I really want to impress upon you that this is not a secret language. This is something that you can learn and become fluent in with practice and by looking at the rocks that you find around you. So the other way to think about the stories in stones is through this illustration. So this is one of my favorite paleo artists. This is Ray Troll. He's an Alaskan artist with a playful style, as you can see. And so on the left, this is an outcrop, right? A stack of rocks, with all the fossils inside of them. And then on the right, I want you to imagine that each color is representing a different tome, a different book, and they're stacked on top of each other. So to use my pointer a little bit here, you can see, let's say that this blue book here is the Paleozoic book, right? And then just like with books, there are smaller units. So we can have chapters like the Cambrian chapter or the Ordovician chapter. And from that, you can go down into pages and paragraphs and sentences. And so similarly, geologists can, go smaller and smaller and look at smaller and smaller units of time and, use those smaller units to tell bigger stories, right? And there's a basic rule or law in geology called the law of superposition, which is a fancy way of saying that the older things are going to be at the bottom and the younger rocks are going to be at the top. And this is a familiar concept to anybody who's rooted around for their favorite sweatshirt in their laundry pile. If you took it off last week, it's going to be deeper than if you took it off last night, right? And there are exceptions to this rule in the rock record, but typically it holds. And so what we're going to be doing today is talking about three stories, three chapters of Wisconsin's history, and we're going to move up through the rock record, right? We're going to start deep and move our way up. Now, one other thing to mention here is that this is a cartoon, right? There isn't actually a place on Earth where you can stand and in one spot read the whole record, so you don't get the full story. All the books aren't stacked in one spot. And instead, we find clues and stories scattered around in the rocks that we have on all of the different continents and at the seafloor. So it's through looking at a road cut here or a quarry there or a drill hole, somewhere else that we're able to collect this information. And by connecting those stories and working together as scientists and as citizens, that we're able to tell complex, interesting stories about the Earth. All right, so to get us started on our journey, I said we were going to start at the bottom. So I've put a star here near the bottom in the Proterozoic. So we're going to be looking at rocks that are 1.75 billion years old. So that's billion with a B. And you may be thinking, okay, yeah, geologists use big numbers, millions, billions. What's the difference a letter makes? Well, I just want to impress upon you, there's a big difference. Now, if you were to count to 1 million, this is maybe you're looking for a pandemic hobby to pick up, and you just start counting 1, 2, 3, one number a second. It would take you about 12 days if you counted around the clock to get to 1 million. So it's doable. Don't know if you're looking for that kind of time sink right now. But if you wanted to count to 1 billion with a B, it would take you 33 years to get that. So really different. One letter makes a big difference, right? So we are going down deep into the rock record here, 1.75 billion years ago. So now we've placed ourselves in time. And I want to show you where we are going in Wisconsin. So we're going to be up kind of in the central part of the state. And what we're looking at, what you can find in the ground there is granite. Now, this is called Montello red granite. And what I want you to notice here, because again, we're thinking about reading the rocks. This is a specimen that's in the museum. And of course, it's, here it's been cut into the shape of Wisconsin and polished. But what we can notice by looking at it is that, it's colorful. We can see most of it's red, but there's also some, black flecks in there. And you can tell there's like a white as well. So those different colors are representing different minerals. And those minerals are, the building blocks of rocks. And if we look even closer, we can see, again, we've got those three colors, and you can notice that the crystals are kind of interlocking. It's hard to really think, they're not like sand grains, right, where they're just distinct from one another. These ones look like they're kind of, grown together. And that really points to how this kind of rock forms. When a geologist sees granite, their brain goes, aha, volcanoes. And so here's just, a little schematic of a volcano. And, the business end of a volcano up here is usually what gets the most attention, right? Explosions, eruptions, that hot lava flowing out of the top. But granite has a quieter story. Granite forms down here in the magma chamber of a volcano. So when volcanoes stop erupting, we say they go extinct. It's the same word we use for animals, right? And so you can imagine if there's leftover melted rock down here in the magma chamber, well, it's not going to erupt anymore. And that magma is just going to cool slowly. It takes thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years for that to form a rock underground, but it will cool slowly. It's insulated because it's surrounded by other rock, but it's going to cool, and the ingredients, those minerals that were all melted together, are going to cool. And you can even imagine they go through kind of a slushy phase where they're starting to grow, but there's still some melted material in there, and then they cool and cool and cool and lock together. And so that's what we have here in Wisconsin. I'm going to show you some historical photos. So these are the Montello granite works in the town of Montello. And you can see there's some very large blocks here in the front, and you can see that they're breaking them down into smaller stones that can be used. And this was it's a very popular building stone. The tomb of Ulysses S. Grant, our 18th president, is made out of this very granite from Wisconsin. And they had lots to choose from. Apparently, they sorted through over 230 different kinds of granite and chose our Wisconsin red granite. Here you can see all of this. This is the quarry, the pit that they're pulling this out of. Here's another shot of the where they're cutting the granite. So a very popular strong building stone used for tombstones, buildings. And then the quarry itself, the one I was showing you, has been closed for decades. And here you can see it's flooded, and you can actually visit it. There's a historical marker there. And another spot you can visit if you don't go up to Montello would be to go to our Capitol building. Again, once it's safe to do so. And if you've been in the Capitol building, it's full of beautiful stone from around the world. And so here's just kind of a quick shot of the interior. Next time you get to visit, you want to pay attention to these pillars, because those are all made out of that very same red granite. So it's by finding granite in the ground that we can say, there used to be a volcano here. And while you look around and you may be thinking, well, I've never seen a volcano in Wisconsin, right? The part that looks like a volcano, the mountain part, has washed away. This was long enough ago, again, 1.75 billion years ago, that the volcano itself has eroded, and all of the rock that was above the magma chamber has eroded, right? So another theme in geology is that small changes over time can add up into big changes. And that's a good example of it, that we can have magma chambers now at the surface of the Earth. All right, moving on to our second chapter. So we're going to move up our rock column here, I've moved the star, and now we're up in the Paleozoic. Now, the star itself didn't move very far on this diagram, but let's remember that that bottom part is very compressed, right? There's 4 billion years of Earth's history represented in that bottom inch of the diagram there. So now we're hopping up into the Ordovician. And so we're going to be roughly about 450 million years ago. So million with an M. It's still a long time ago. If you think about the dinosaurs, you know, this is basically twice as old as the oldest dinosaurs, right? And we are going to be, the rocks we're going to be looking at are from the southern part of the state. So I've roughly outlined in red here where you can find these rocks at the surface of the Earth now. And to get at why we have these particular kinds of rocks, I just want to back up and tell you a little bit more broadly about geology. And this may be a refresher for some, but there's the theory of plate tectonics is a big deal in geology. It helps us understand how the Earth works. And the idea is basically that the outer layer of the Earth, the crust, is a bit like a shell of an egg, right? And it's cracked and broken. Here you can see in the schematic, you know, any of these black lines are where these, you know, major cracks are in the Earth's crust. So these are what we call plate boundaries. And then each of these different colors on here is representing a plate. And of course, when I say plate, you may think dinner plate, but these of course are much, much bigger than a dinner plate. So here is the North American plate. And you can start to, you know, make sense of some of the things you know about the Earth. We know that here in Wisconsin, we don't really experience earthquakes all that much. And that's because we're not near one of these plate boundaries now. We don't have volcanoes here right now, right? And that is also explained by not being near a plate boundary. But here we do know, you go out to California, you go up to Alaska, you know, you think about the western coast of South America, those are places we think of volcanoes and earthquakes, right? And that's because they're on these plate boundaries. So that's all to say, again, small changes over time can add up to big changes. And where these boundaries are, the plates are shifting and moving and changing. Crust is being created and destroyed there all the time. So if we rewind the tape back 450 million years, the Earth looks a little different. So here we're going to take a peek at Earth. This is a artist's rendition of what North America would have looked like when it was south of the equator, no longer North America. So what you're looking at here is the brown is land, the blue is water, the light blue is shallow water. I'm going to circle Wisconsin here. So look at us on a frigid day like today. You know, people are, you know, in normal times, we'd be thinking about spring break and maybe going somewhere warm. Well, Wisconsin of 450 million years ago would be a great place to visit. We were tropical, got broad sandy beaches. And so you'll notice the map that I showed you earlier, I was saying the southern part of the state has the rocks we're going to be looking at. So look at this, you know, we're tipped on the side, but all of this in here, that's where we're finding the rocks that are telling the next piece of our story. So here is an example of some of these. This is in Door County. You can see these beige blocky rocks. Here is a picture of a quarry in Middleton. Again, I imagine this looks a little familiar to you. If you've driven on Highway 18, you've driven on Highway 14, you've seen these rocks, right? So to put these things together, we've got these beige rocks. If you hold them in your hand, you can imagine, you know, it's kind of like mud, right? Mud that's turned to stone. And so if we could time travel back, we would take our snorkels along with us because again, we were covered by water at that time. So the rock that we have today was laid down at the bottom of an ocean, this shallow tropical sea. And if you were snorkeling at this time, this might be what you would see around you. This is a diorama from the Milwaukee Public Museum. And you can see this coral reef here. It looks a little familiar. These fellows look a little different than what you might see today. They are relatives of squid and octopus, which you can see that similarity here. So what does this look like in the rocks? Right, we've seen a quarry and that Door County outcrop. Here is what, we've got a slab of fossils here. And so again, looking at the rock, you can tell it's just kind of plain beige rock. Again, tiny little particles of mud that are held together. And then on the surface here, there's all this texture, and you can see it's full of fossils. Now, I'm going to walk you through a few of these fossils and fossils that you can find here in southern Wisconsin. But first, I just want to explain a little bit of what you're looking at, because sometimes these can be confusing. You see them and you might think, huh, yeah, I can tell it's a fossil, but I don't really understand what I'm looking at here. And part of that's because here in Wisconsin, a lot of what we're looking at are internal molds. And what that means is that the shell is not there anymore. But what we have is the material that filled in the shell. So by way of example, here's my niece making a sandcastle. And so she's filling up the bucket with sand. Imagine that bucket is actually a shell and it's getting filled with mud, right? And then what you flip it over, you pull off the bucket and you're left with your sandcastle, which is an internal mold of the bucket. And here, the fossils that we find a lot of times are the internal molds of the shells. So here's a great example. This is a fossil snail. And again, the shell itself is gone, but what we have is that plug of mud that filled in the shell before it dissolved away. And another example of missing the shell, but getting to see the mold, here's an external mold. So whenever you find something that looks like a little tornado in the rock, it's usually an external mold of a snail shell. So you can see here, it looks like a little whirlpool. And so that's revealing the outside of the shell, right? So snails obviously were part of the creatures on the seafloor there. If you remember the squid relative that I showed you in that diorama, they are called cephalopods. And here are two pretty classic examples of what their fossils can look like. So here on the left is a chunk of a cephalopod fossil. And this is just a piece. I would say this probably comes from, a creature that would have been on the order of 10 or maybe 12 feet long. And the squid itself just lived in the end of the chamber, and then they have this long shell extending out the back. And what's neat about these creatures, they were really sophisticated. The insides of their shells were broken into chambers. And then the chambers were connected by a tube, which is one of my favorite geology terms. It's called a siphuncle. And so they could move air and water in between those chambers a little bit like a submarine, right? So they could move up and down in the water column, right? Become more or less buoyant. So when we look at the fossil again, you can see on the right-hand side here, this also is the fossil from one of these cephalopods. But what has happened is whatever was a negative space, whatever was a hole in the shell is now filled with sediment. Okay, so you get these chambers represented by sediment. And then here's that siphuncle. You can see it connecting all the tubes. But this is confusing, right? You can find this in a rock, and it certainly, you would not be silly to think, this kind of looks like a backbone of a creature. But this is from a time period before there were backbones, really. So to really speak of. So here, when you find that sort of thing in the rock, what you're actually seeing is the shell of a cephalopod, or the internal mold of a cephalopod. Okay, another creature. These ones are really interesting and fun. These are trilobites. The one on the right here is actually our state fossil. And these are relatives of bugs. They're in that same family of bugs and horseshoe crabs. And they would have been swimming around in these waters as well. And finally, just kind of to round out the menagerie here, our corals, of course. You know, Wisconsin actually is very famous, especially out in the Milwaukee area, for our fossil coral reefs. And so these are a few examples of what those corals can look like when you find them in these rocks. So it's through looking at these rocks, understanding that we're looking at, you know, sediment that was at the bottom of the ocean. We find fossils that are from sea creatures. And that's what's telling us and pointing us to, oh, we used to be covered by a shallow tropical sea, because of all of the clues that the rocks are giving us, that we can tell, you know, this bigger story about Wisconsin in the past. Okay, our last chapter, the third chapter, we're bouncing way up into, you know, basically yesterday, and, you know, when geologists think about this. So we are scooting up from, we were just in the Ordovician down here in the blue. We've jumped up into the Pleistocene. And part of why I skip a lot of this is because we actually don't have those rocks here in Wisconsin, right? Those chapters have been torn out of the book. And if you want to learn about dinosaurs and find dinosaurs, or the rocks that, you know, represent the environments the dinosaurs lived in, you're not going to find them here in Wisconsin. So in our museum, our scientist takes his students out to the field in Wyoming every summer. And that's where they look for dinosaur fossils and other creatures that lived at the same time, because we don't have those rocks here. So our last chapter, we're jumping up into what is known as the Ice Age. And to think about where we can tell the story of the Ice Age in Wisconsin, I couldn't put my finger on just one part of this map, because, to be honest, our whole state can tell the story of the Ice Age. So if we look at what the Earth looked like, what North America looked like during what we call the last glacial maximum, so the time when the ice was at its furthest extent most recently, this is what we get. So here, down here in Madison, we were really close to right at the edge of the ice sheet. And just to give you a little context here, I mean, you can see it, but imagine you climbed up onto this ice sheet and you started hiking north. You could walk all the way to the North Pole without getting off of ice during the last ice age. So it's easy to think, oh yeah, there was ice in Wisconsin, but that ice was connected to ice that went all the way to the North Pole. So just to focus on Wisconsin though, this map on the right traces that farthest extent of the ice during the last glacial maximum. So you can see it flowed down here into Dane County, and you can actually hike what's called the Ice Age Trail, which is a trail that follows where the ice margin would have been. And so that's what's traced out here on the left-hand side. Now, this is an image from Greenland, but I want you to just, I put this here so you can really get the sense of ice flowing. You know, our experience of ice isn't that it flows. it doesn't seem like that to us. When you take ice cubes and put them in your lemonade in the summertime, they crack and snap and break and are brittle. But big piles of ice like this in Greenland and what would have been here in Wisconsin and North America during the Ice Age, it flows. It can deform plastically and flow. It's just slow. And so you can really see that in this image here, that you can watch where the ice has flowed, and it's finding the path of least resistance, just like water would, right? Liquid water would. And so it's flowing down into the valleys here. And so where ice moves over the land, it is really, really good at carrying rocks and dirt along with it. I like to think of glaciers as being dump trucks, that they pick up material, they freeze it into the bed of the glacier, and then they just carry it along. And that ice is always flowing. It's just when it starts to melt faster than it is flowing forward, that's when it seems like we call it receding, but it's not that it turned around or it started flowing the other direction. It's just melting faster than it's flowing. But what happens right there is, at the toe of the glacier, right? That is where all of the material that the glaciers are transporting, it gets dumped at the end. And we call those moraines. So I'm going to show you some of the landforms that you can see here in Wisconsin, because really a lot of the surface of our state tells this story of being covered by ice in the past. So here, this is a drumlin that you can see here. These form underneath the ice. There's for geologists, a world famous field of drumlins. If you drive between Madison and Milwaukee, that is a spot that geologists travel to visit those drumlins and to study them, because there's just so many of them, and they can help us understand their formation and some of the ice flow. This is Prairie Moraine Dog Park down in Verona. And this pile here, this is all left by the glacier. So you can imagine the ice sitting just beyond here, and it just shedding all of this material and forming this mound. If you've gone sledding at Elver Park in Madison, that's another one of these spots where the ice has just left behind all of this debris. If you've climbed Bascom Hill on campus, if you've gone to the Capitol building in Madison, these are all glacial landforms that these landmarks are sitting on. These are kettles. So Kettle Moraine State Park. The kettles, these spots where water collects, those are remnants of chunks of ice that fell off the front of the glacier and melted and left a hole there that now collects more water. Just like you see dramatic pictures of glaciers calving into the ocean, the same thing can happen on land, except for there's no water for it to dump into, so it just lays on the ground and melts there and leaves behind these kettle lakes. For any farmers in the crowd today, this would be a familiar sight. Maybe you've had to pick rocks out of your farm fields in the past. You can thank the glaciers for those too. They left behind all of those rocks. So here you can see there's a pasture where they didn't pick the rocks out, and maybe threw some of the rocks from the farm fields into that spot. So that would be one tactic. Another way people have dealt with all of these rocks left behind in what are now farm fields, is to make these walls, rock walls. So this is Pope Farm Park out in Middleton. And here you can see just the diversity of different kinds of rocks that were left behind. And these can look really weird to us, right? We're used to these beige rocks from the Paleozoic in southern Wisconsin. And then you find, these dark black rocks or red rocks. And that's because they come from up north. The glacier brought them here and dumped them for us to pick out of farm fields and discover on our hikes. One other fun feature I wanted to show you, this is called a came, and it's just kind of, pile. It's almost like a cone-shaped hill. And these form from these, when I worked on the Matanuska Glacier, we called these toilet bowls, because you can see all this water is rushing from the surface of the glacier and going into this hole. Well, what's left behind is this pile of debris after the ice melts. And I would be remiss to not include some of the fossils that we can find that also tell us about the creatures that lived here during the Ice Age. So here on the left is a mammoth, on the right is a mastodon. When you get to come visit the museum, you can visit this mastodon, the bones of which that are real were found in Wisconsin in the late 1890s. And they were not found by scientists. They were not found by adults. The bones were found by children after a big storms. You get those big thunderstorms in the summer that washed away some of the dirt and soil on their farms, and they found bones. So this has been on display in our museum for over 100 years. Other fossils that have been found in Wisconsin include muskox, caribou. These are animals we associate with the Arctic today. This is a creature that is extinct now. They're called stag moose. So they're in that same family of elk and moose, but they have these incredibly menacing horns, very big beams with these intricate antlers. Another creature that is not alive today is the giant beaver. And so here on the right, you can see this is a part of a lower jaw of a beaver that was found in Lake Monona. So these are massive beavers, probably on this order of the size of black bears. And then of course, humans. We know from finding archaeological evidence that humans were here at 12,000 years ago, and sometimes hunting those other creatures that we are looking at, and eking out a living here in Wisconsin. So we have a long and rich history in Wisconsin, and it's through finding those fossils, looking at those rocks, that we're really able to tell these broader stories. And so with that, I would really welcome you to, nurture your curiosity, go outside and explore. These are some books that I recommend picking up. They're really fantastic to help, you become more fluent as a rock reader. And then of course, when it's safe to do so, go visit your local museums. And there are so many rock and mineral clubs around the state. And you can always find other people who are curious about this stuff at those. So with that, I will turn it over to Fran. I know that she's got her eyes on the chat. So if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat.
Yeah, Brooke, thank you so much. That is just so interesting. And I love how you presented it in such an organized manner, taking us through the annals of time. So thank you for that. We do have some engagement in the chat. Let's see. So Polly Cisco is asking, where in Wisconsin can I go to look for fossils?
So your best luck, if you're looking for those sea creature fossils, any road cut is a good one. In southern Wisconsin is a good spot to look for fossils. I often point people, if you're in the Madison area, I point people to a spot off of Highway PD, just south of, it's like right on the edge of Verona and Madison. There's a Hy-Vee and a Target there. And behind them, when they blasted for a road, there's still an outcrop there. And if you look at the rocks at the bottom of that hill, you'll find fossils. But so anywhere that you can find rock outcrops that have those beige rocks, good spot to go and just check out. What we typically find is that the rocks or the fossils tend to be concentrated in layers. And so you'll pick up lots of rocks and just nothing. And then you might pick up one block, like the one I showed, where it's just like, whoa, this is a jackpot. There's a whole bunch of fossils here. And those are interpreted as being storm deposits that storms would blow through and kick up all the mud at the bottom of the ocean. And then the heavy stuff, the shells, would fall out first and then be covered by mud. So you end up with these blank patches and then jackpot layers. So I'd encourage you to just be patient. And if you don't see anything, just put it down and pick up another rock.
Great suggestions, thanks. And who knew, I'm obviously coming from a place where I have no background in geology, but I've seen the signs of kettle moraine and the words drumlin, and I didn't realize there was geological history behind all those words. So, and that's just every day almost that you see and have in front of you, not realizing. We have a question from Terry Rauscher. And they're asking, when you say shallow sea, approximately what would the deepest depth be?
Yeah, so the sea level fluctuated over time. We're talking about tens of millions of years ultimately, where the sea level was changing. But we're going from shoreline, right, where you're right on the beach, to maybe 100 feet deep, 150 feet deep. And the rocks change. Like, we can look at the rocks and we can see features that tell us, oh, it was a beach at this time. And then sea level went up. And we can see, by looking at the rocks in the same place, we can tell that sea level changed and got deeper and more shallow and deeper and more shallow. And that's by looking at the type of rock and the fossils that we're finding in those individual layers. And some of the features within the rock can tell us if it was on the right on the beach or if it was deeper. So, but I would say, yeah, we're going to about like 100, 150 feet deep, not that deep.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, Polycisco comments, I live in the driftless. Also, Debbie Whitley commented with a chuckle, it feels like the North Pole now here.
I feel ya. Yeah, and the driftless, that's another word that comes from geology. We talk about the driftless area. So an old term for all of the debris that glaciers dropped, geologists called that drift in the past. Now we call it till, but it was called drift. And so that southwestern part of our state was never covered by ice. And so it is the driftless area. There is no drift on it. So that's a geology term too.
Interesting. Never knew that. All right, awesome. Suzanne Gaines comments, nice ground level images of drumlins. How high might the receding glacier have appeared from this view? 2 times higher than the drumlin? 100 times higher?
Yeah, so my understanding is that where the drumlins are forming, because they're forming under the ice, it's a feature, some of these features like moraines are happening at the edge of the ice where the ice is melting and dropping debris. Drumlins are forming under the ice. And so there would have been hundreds of feet of ice on top of where those drumlins are forming.
Very interesting. Thank you. Let's see. Why no, Arnie Vasky's asking, oh, I lost him. Why no rocks from the dinosaur era?
I know, it's a bummer, right? Basically, they've eroded away. We would have had dinosaurs living here at that time, but all of that part of the rock record has eroded. And so we don't have it here anymore. So it's just a matter of that rock has washed away over time.
Al Warner's asking, did a previous ice age create ancient Lake Wisconsin?
Yes, so there is what's called Glacial Lake Wisconsin. And this is a really great story too. You can imagine the slides I was showing you where the ice has flowed over much of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin River got plugged up. It got blocked by ice, and so it couldn't continue flowing. And all of that water just pooled up in front of the ice. And so if you drive Highway 94 up to Minneapolis, there is an area where it's really flat. It's really sandy and flat. And there are these towers of rock that stand up out of kind of this flat ground. That is the former bottom of Glacial Lake, Wisconsin. And what happened is that when the ice melted back, right, and it receded, then you've got all this water sitting there and it's not plugged anymore. And there was a huge flood. This would have been over the course of days, maybe weeks. All the water that was in this very large lake rushed south and found a new path. And so the dells, the Wisconsin dells, were carved during that flood. It's part of the, all of this water finding a new path and the Wisconsin River finding a new route that the dells were carved. So yes, that Glacial Lake, Wisconsin is a part of the Ice Age story.
Wow, and what a special part of the state we have with those dells too.
Yeah.
Heather Young is asking, how do you tell how old fossils are when you find them?
Mm-hmm. So what geologists do is when we're trying to find a certain kind of rock, or fossil, like when our scientist at the Geology Museum says, I want to find dinosaurs, first thing he would do would be to consult his maps to figure out where is rock of the right age to find that kind of fossil. And then you launch your expedition to go there. Here in Wisconsin, when you find a fossil and you're curious about how old it is, the fossils you'd be finding that are from the sea creatures would all be in that range of, like 420 to 500 million years old. And so in that case, you finding a fossil that's from a sea creature, you're trusting us to know that, right? To say how old it is. How we know that is because within those rock layers, the mud and the sand that were left behind by this shallow sea, there were volcanic ash layers. So there were volcanoes that were erupting over near the East Coast. That ash got laid down within the mud. That ash is something that we can actually use a machine to radiometrically date. So we can take the minerals out of that ash layer and we can tell when they cooled, when they crystallized. And that's how we can put these kind of markers as to like, oh, everything that's between this ash layer and this ash layer is bracketed and it must be no older than this age and no younger than this age. And so people have done that work to figure out how old these ash layers are. And by that, we're able to say, oh, all the fossils we find in between here are within this time period.
Very interesting. Thank you. Two more questions. So how were the sandstone bluffs around Camp Douglas created? Do you know that one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those bluffs are part of that Glacial Lake, Wisconsin story. So they would have been, some of them were formed and kind of shaped by waves in that lake crashing up against them. And so you can even imagine, if you were able to time travel back to that time, yeah, there would have been these like little islands sticking up within within that lake that were being shaped by the lake as well.
And the last question from Jennifer Tuffer, what part of the state do you find mastodons?
The mastodon that we have in the Geology Museum is a composite of 2 skeletons. So there were 2 different locations where bones were found from an adult mastodon. And then at our museum, we used those 2 skeletons to make 1 specimen that you can see on display. Both of those skeletons were from southwestern Wisconsin, from the driftless area. One was found near Boaz, Wisconsin, which is just south of Richland Center. And one is from what's called Anderson Mills, which is no longer a town anymore. But so mastodon and mammoth skeletons have been found in the southern part of the state. There are other ones that are out in the southeastern area of the state too.
All right, happy fossil hunting, everyone. I have a quick Fran question for you. What's the coolest fossil you've ever found?
Oh, that I've ever found.
Mm-hmm.
The one that comes to mind is my favorite because it's surprising. I was working in Canada. It was called Dinosaur Provincial Park, which is a place where you can find dinosaurs, and it's there's so many dinosaurs there. It's a little crazy. And I was helping with an excavation, and people were finding dinosaur fossils, and it was really exciting. And I was assigned my little square foot and my little tools, and I found this tiny fossil, and I carefully got it out of the rock, and I took it over to the lead scientist and showed it to him. And I didn't think it was going to be much of anything. It was too small to be a dinosaur. And he got really excited because it turned out it was from a mammal that he loved, that we found something so small and something that was not a dinosaur, because it helps to, fill out the picture, right? What were the other animals that were living at the same time as the dinosaurs in this place? And it also, it speaks to how kind of slow and deliberate you have to be when you're cleaning these things off, because if you're just blowing through there with a shovel, you're going to miss the small things. So you got to take it slow.
That's super cool. Well, thanks so much, Brooke, for sharing all this information with us. And you have a pretty cool job. So thanks for sharing that too. Everybody, please, when you get a chance, when it's safe, please do go check out the UW Geology Museum. So many interesting things there to see. So thanks for tuning in today. Please join us next week. We're going to be meeting on Wednesday at noon next week instead of Tuesday. And Brandon Quarles, who is the Associate Lecturer of Saxophone, is going to be talking about everybody's favorite group, the Fab Four, the Beatles. He taught a course at Northwestern on it. He's going to be with us as a UW faculty member next week. He's going to be talking about 2 of their most popular songs. So tell all your Beatle fans and friends at noon next Wednesday. As always, check out badgertalks.wisc.edu for the upcoming schedule, and you can certainly join our email list there too to get upcoming information about future talks. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.